Preparing live stream. If the content of this meeting is being sent to one or more apps. Okay. And we are live. Welcome everybody to the next iteration of the Slavery Archive Book Club. I am your co-host together with Ana Lucia Araujo, who is on her phone right now walking in a German street, and she will be joining us on video soon. My name is Alex Heath. I am at Yale University, and Lucia Araujo is at Howard University. And today with us, we have Chloe Ireton from University College London, where she works on the history of Iberia and the Iberian world, as it is particularly as it relates to slavery, freedom, empire, and the formation of public spheres, which we will be talking about today. Chloe is also a British Academy Wolfson Fellow. And we're very honored and happy to have her. She's also a friend of a lot of friends, as I was commenting off screen. And I am so happy that we get to talk to her about her book today, Slavery and Freedom in Black Thought in the Early Spanish Atlantic. So while Anna gets to her final destination, I'm going to pass the mic to Chloe, who I think has a small presentation for us. The way we usually do this is that our invited guests present their book for 20, 30 minutes, and then we start the conversation and pass it to you. As our guest, Chloe, presents, feel free though to start putting your questions in the chat. It's always nice to have a lively chat while we're listening to our guest author. So, Chloe, thank you for joining us. We're very excited to talk about your book. I really, really, really enjoyed it from cover to cover. So, without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. And just thank you to Ana Lucia and Alex for this wonderful invitation, for the dialogue, the conversation, the reading. It's such a privilege and a pleasure to be here and just to be able to share some of this work and hopefully open up the debate afterwards. So thanks a lot for the effort and for all of you coming here on a Saturday evening in Europe. This is really magnificent. So yeah, I'm going to do a little kind of 20-minute introduction just to hopefully kind of give those who haven't read it a sense of what the book's about. And hopefully it'll give us a lot of things to talk about and et cetera in the discussion. But I'm actually going to start with a short vignette that I've been drafting as part of a broader public history writing project, just as a way of kind of introducing some of the themes of the book. Let's see, how do we move? 1 second. Okay, I need to physically move it. All right, so yeah, this is a kind of just a little public history thing I've been writing and thinking about, and hopefully it will kind of segue into the introduction to the book. So the notary's office stood at the edge of a bustling marketplace where town criers auctioned exotic goods from faraway lands. Here, commercial activity often engulfed the religious sanctity of the cathedral as merchants and auctioneers sprawled across its northern steps, where we see the arrow pointing towards on this map. Sometimes even spilling into the interior grounds, much to the ire of generations of archbishops. This was a precipitous moment. Felipa de la Cruz had spent her entire life hoping for liberty and plotting for her freedom from slavery. But none of her efforts had been so dangerous as her intentions on this day. Times were desperate. A recent tragedy had dashed her hopes for liberation, and her risky calculation was the culmination of an entire life spent carefully thinking about how to obtain her precious liberty. But before reaching the notary's storefront, Felipa's path had probably collided with the wretched spectacle of enslaved black men and women locked in chains, awaiting their torturous fates to the highest bidder at the steps of the cathedral. Again, where it's marked on this map. On these steps, known as gradas, town criers and prospective buyers haggled over prices. And like those awaiting their fates on the auction block, Felipa was also deprived of her liberty. Born enslaved in late 16th century Sevilla, Felipa was acutely aware of the miserable trade in enslaved West Africans in the Spanish Empire. Her own parents had probably been enslaved in West Africa and forcibly displaced to European shores. Perched at Gradas amidst the commotion of sales and bartering, Felipa would bear witness to the inevitable destruction of kinship ties as mothers and children were sold to different enslavers separated by the demands of the market. And this torturous scene would serve as a patent reminder to Felipa of her own enslavement. And even though Felipa once described how her enslavers treated her well, she knew that her family could be ripped apart in an instant. And inside the dusty walls of the notary's premises, the seconds may have felt vertiginous for Felipa, but the day was ordinary for the notary and his industrious team of apprentices and scribes who meticulously transformed verbal agreements into public legal records. And Felipa was no stranger to the notarial trade. Like any enslaved black woman forced to eke out an existence in the Spanish monarchy, she knew very well that enslavers who agreed to liberate their slaves would legalize the agreement before a public notary, like the one that she was in today, who would issue a legally binding freedom certificate known as a Carta de Alorría. These documents were a precious possession that could protect a hard-won liberty. And for women in particular, possession of such a document could or might ensure that their children were born free. This is because Spanish legal code stipulated that the condition of slavery was inherited matrilineally, and so it was only a mother's liberty that could guarantee her children's freedom. Scanning the bound volumes of carefully filed agreements that attested to the commercial bustle of the world around her, Felipa was acutely aware that a public notary had the power to issue legal documents that could change the course of her life. She had spent her entire life discussing the laws of slavery and freedom and attempting to inch closer to obtaining her precious liberty. Just go. My new book, Slavery and Freedom in Black Thought in the Early Spanish Atlantic, is an intellectual history that explores how West Africans and West Central Africans and their descendants reckoned with the violent world of Atlantic slavery that they were forced to inhabit, and traces how they conceptualized two strands of political and legal thought, freedom and slavery, in the early Spanish Empire. As members of this book club well know, in the early modern era, over 12.5 million people were enslaved, dispossessed, and forcibly displaced from sites in West Africa and West Central Africa to European imperial realms, where the meanings of slavery and freedom were codified into distinct rules of law. These laws and traditions often differed from legal cultures about slavery and freedom in enslaved people's places of origin, or the sites where they or their ancestors were first enslaved. And enslaved people who were disembarked in chains in the port towns of the Atlantic world after surviving the horrors of the Middle Passage often learned about the laws that governed slavery and freedom in European imperial realms and their American colonies through their discussions with other enslaved people. And these discussions took place at every stage in the wretched journey of violent dispossession and displacement into the world of European Atlantic slavery, namely in the port towns in West Africa and West Central Africa, on slave ships sailing through the treacherous Middle Passage, and during punishing labor regimes in nascent American slave societies and in Europe. These ephemeral conversations between enslaved people about the laws of slavery and freedom constituted an exchange of precious knowledge and legal know-how that shaped Black life and thought in the early Atlantic world. In the Spanish Empire in particular, enslaved people soon learned that their status was governed by Castilian legal codes of slavery and freedom, namely those enshrined in the 13th century legal codes called the Siete Partidas, as well as a rich tradition of legal custom that had emerged through particular court cases. In their daily lives, Africans and their descendants grappled with laws and theological discourses that legitimized the enslavement of people who were racialized as Black by Europeans in the early modern Atlantic world, and the varied meanings of freedom across legal jurisdictions, especially different imperial jurisdictions. They discussed ideas about slavery and freedom with kin, friends, and associates in the sites where they lived and across vast distances, often generating thick spheres of communication in the early modern Atlantic world. And discussions about freedom and its varied meanings moved from place to place through diverse exchanges of information, fractured memories, and knowledge between Black communities and kin across the Atlantic. The chronological and territorial frames of the study are necessarily wide due to the broad geographical scales of these intellectual exchanges and the diverse methodological approaches that I deployed in response to the invisibility of these histories in any particular archive. So the book traces how Black communities and kin exchanged ideas about slavery and freedom across the long 16th century in the Spanish Atlantic world, and in particular sketches the emergence of thick spheres of communication among free and enslaved Black people between key port towns through relays of word of mouth, epistolary networks, and legal powers. And I just want to mention here, orality and soundscape is a big part of this project as well. In particular, everyday lives and experiences in the ports that constituted the maritime trading routes in the late 16th century Spanish Atlantic, which were namely the ones that appear on the red line here, the Carrera de Indias, Cartagena, Havana, Nombre de Dios, Sevilla, Veracruz, as well as the towns dotted along trading routes between key ports and the viceregal capitals, especially Lima and Mexico City. All of these places were often intertwined with events across the Atlantic, as ship passengers and port dwellers often trafficked in mundane and noteworthy information about people and events in faraway places. People were always gossiping in this period. Relays of word of mouth stitched through itinerant merchant communities, mariners and passengers bridged vast distances across the Spanish Empire and allowed Black dwellers to send and receive messages from kin and associates from afar. Tapping official and informal messengers sometimes allowed Black people to partake in a lettered world of communication by sending and receiving missives that traveled across the Atlantic. And rare surviving letters penned by enslaved Black people to their distant kin also reveal conversations about their hopes and expectations of freedom. And just in the next few slides, I'm going to show a few details of an extraordinary vista of Sevilla painted by Alonso Coello in the late 16th century that shows the impact of the arrival of the fleets from the Americas. And it's also printed in the book. So here's the whole image. It's a really gorgeous painting. It's being hung in the Museo de Américas in Madrid. And we're just going to look at a few of the details of it, showing kind of all the passers-by coming towards the river to meet the passengers coming off ships and all of the kind of economy that emerges around it. And we'll just finish on this last one here. So here in the last detail, I've highlighted the depiction of a woman of African descent who approached the shores of the Guadalquivir River during the arrival of the fleets from the Americas, perhaps to talk or trade with passengers who were disembarking, or perhaps in the hopes of receiving a message from a loved one from across the Atlantic. I just found it really interesting that the artist kind of portrayed this figure here. So the book is an exploration of the rich, complicated, and worldly lives of people of African descent as they negotiated experiences of enslavement and liberation from slavery in the early modern Spanish Empire. The book crisscrosses multiple scales of analysis from micro to macro, from the formal to the intimate, and from individuals' engagement with institutional processes to their spatial cosmographies. And in disparate but intimately tied sites in the early Spanish Empire, from Sevilla and Mexico City to Nombre de Dios and Lima, among other key ports and towns, West Africans, West Central Africans, and their descendants not only traveled or were forcibly displaced between such spaces and constructed a Black Iberian world, but actively assembled a dynamic Black public sphere across oceans, seas, and overland trading routes, and offered, I argue, their own competing intellectual visions of slavery and freedom. In this shared Black Iberian Atlantic world, the meanings of freedom and slavery and freedom were fiercely contested and claimed. Throughout 6 chapters, I explore how freedom was regarded as a possession that enslaved, free, and liberated people sought to protect, document, purchase, practice, and define. Free and enslaved people of African descent understood freedom as a legal and a juridical condition constituted in law, but they also saw liberty as somewhat elastic as they tried to shape and expand its meanings in their lives, as well as regarding liberty as a possession that they should certainly strive to protect, since they understood that their freedom could easily be stolen or taken away from them. And weaving together thousands of archival fragments, including personal letters, depositions and trials, commercial agreements, and petitions to the Crown, the study pieces together the lives of Black men and women both in metropolitan Spain and the colonies, how people moved from one place to another, and more importantly, how ideas and information moved and operated in different contexts, while trying to map the development of early modern Black thought about slavery and freedom. Free and enslaved people who moved freely or by force across the Atlantic shared information and legal knowledge with those they met along the way. And their intellectual labor invites us to reimagine the epistemic worlds of the early modern Atlantic, from a free Black mother's embarkation license to cross the Atlantic as a passenger on a ship, or an enslaved civilian woman's letters to her freed husband in New Spain, or an enslaved man's negotiations for credit arrangements with prospective buyers on the auction block in Mexico City, to a black man's petition to a royal court in an attempt to reclaim his liberty after his illegitimate enslavement. The book traces how Africans and their descendants were important intellectual actors in the early modern Atlantic world who reckoned with ideas about slavery and freedom. And so just for the last few minutes, to trace this intellectual history, I deploy various methodological frameworks throughout the study, often inspired by the spatial turn in the history of ideas. And these spatially inspired methodological activities often involve assembling many different archival fragments from a diverse range of archives to visualize a history of ideas about slavery and freedom in a particular place or across spaces that was rarely visible in any single archive. So one of the big problems of this book was kind of how to write this story, what kind of methods. So in the last few minutes, I just want to summarize a few of these methods and talk through one in greater detail. In particular, I'm going to summarize three approaches, but it's not all of the approaches, but I think it's the ones that are kind of used most throughout the study. So the first approach was thinking about a longue durée cultural history of people's interactions with institutional processes. For example, that of liberated Black people's petitions for passenger and embarkation licenses to the Americas through the institution of the House of Trade. And essentially, it's a chapter that explores how people, a diverse array of people, hundreds of thousands of people, come through into an institution, interact with it, and then leave, right? And so what kind of intellectual history can we write from that process of thinking through that sort of, in a way, kind of seeing people in motion, but they make their record there. And I explore it to explore people's participation in a legal culture of freedom papers, what freedom papers mean to people in their lives. But the method was really about staying still with the institution and watching people kind of interacting with it and going on. The second was also spatial, but in a different way, the tracing of different ideas, events, and political moments that seem unconnected to each other, completely unconnected and random, but trying to map them in particular geographic landscape to explore potential moments of exchange and fellowship between individuals and communities residing in different sites, specifically to think about how ideas are moving across. And so there's a sort of, across a couple of the chapters, I try to map all these unconnected events in one place, large space, and think about what that means for the history of ideas. And the third one I want to talk about, which I'll go into a little bit more detail, is the opposite. It's an exploration of how people who stay in one place are impacted by ideas and people on the move, even if they stay still, in particular in this case, while trapped in captivity. So I'll just take a moment to elaborate slightly on this third method through an example, which links to the opening vignette. So chapter 2 explores the various pursuits of freedom of a woman, enslaved Black woman called Felipa de la Cruz in late 16th century Sevilla, who I mentioned in the introductory remarks. And she left an unusual corpus of historical documents as she penned 2 private letters in which she discussed her enslaved condition and desire for freedom. And she sent these with trusted messengers who crossed the vast expanses of the Atlantic Ocean. For those who are teaching topics in early modern history or Atlantic history or gender, you may be interested to know that I've transcribed and translated these letters in the coda of the book. Here, that's what the coda looks like. And here's an example of the first translation of it. The methodology that I deployed to trace Cruz's ideas about freedom played with various scales of analysis, often shifting between micro and macro lenses to explore her world and her hopes and expectations about liberty for herself and for her children, as well as a broader history of ideas about freedom and mutual aid practices in Sevilla. The micro scale involves drawing on information, sorry, I'll keep that there, penned by Cruz in her own letters to explore the urban environment that she inhabited, her walks in the neighborhood, her community ties and neighbors, and the key institutions of the Spanish crown that she interacted with throughout her lifetime. And she grew up enslaved here in this aristocratic household in late 16th century Sevilla. The building today has this facade, but I've actually, well, it's since discovered it was much smaller in the 16th century, but nonetheless, it was a significant casa palacio. And it was in the parish of Salvador, which is the outline you can see here. Number 1 is the palace. And so in particular, in this chapter, what I do is I follow her footsteps on a 15-minute walk through her neighborhood in an attempt to trace her daily life in the city, her participation in spheres of communication between Black neighbors, her networks of friends and kin in the broader Atlantic world, and her know-how about freedom. I'm just going to show you, I'm not going to talk about the book, but I just want to show you what the map looks like that we drew. This is superseded on an 18th century map. And so 1 is the palace where she was born, and 2 to 6 are all the places that she likely stopped at or that we know she stopped at. And in the book, it's printed on 2 sides. That's the left-hand side, and that's the right-hand side. And number 5 is the same vista that we just saw of the ships arriving. It's kind of being down the riverbanks. So in addition, in an attempt to develop a more nuanced understanding of Felipa's world, I also went from the micro to the macro, expanding to a macro vista of Black life in late 16th century Sevilla, trying to explore how Felipa de la Cruz's letters to her absent husband might represent a broader history of Black residents' transatlantic ties with kin and associates in the Americas. Assembling diverse archival materials that catalogue how hundreds of free and liberated Black men and women crossed the Atlantic as passengers on ships, I found also revealed fragmentary evidence of other spheres of communication between Black and African-descended residents of Sevilla with kin and their associates in the Americas, especially through word of mouth, not just through letters, but actually just through word of mouth, people sending messages to each other, but also letters, and a history of fractured community memories of liberations from slavery, all of which inevitably impacted enslaved Black Sevilla dwellers' ideas and hopes about liberty. Anyway, to show all of this, I drew a slightly different map, which this is the title of it. It's a very long title. But essentially, it's a map of all of Sevilla and all of the parishes and all of the neighbors within Felipa's generation and the ties that they might have. So Maria de la O grew up enslaved in the same parish as Felipa, and all of these arrows show the different witnesses that she had when she applied for a license. So we can talk more about that if you like. But through this reconstruction of Felipa's world, as well as other work to trace her various interactions with royal institutions in pursuit of her freedom, the chapter traces how even though she remained trapped in captivity for most, if not all of her life, as we don't know whether she was liberated, that she was also a member of an emerging lettered Black public sphere in late 16th century Sevilla and had important ideas about the meanings of slavery and freedom. So just to close, as a mode of closing this very short introduction, I'll say the following about slavery and freedom in Black thought. The book tries to offer both a deep exploration of how enslaved and free Black people conceptualized and sought to make meaning of the legal categories of slavery and freedom in the Spanish Empire. But it is also a deep methodological reflection and meditation on how we might write a history of ideas and exchanges that are not readily visible in any one archive and that were exchanged over astonishingly large territorial scales. The study hopes to chart some tentative new paths for methodological approaches to the study of intellectual history from below, and find ways to catalogue the vast intellectual production by people who were dispossessed of their liberty in the age of European empires of the Atlantic world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Chloe. I thought that was pretty good summary. It's hard to encapsulate the book, even though I have to say it's one of the better organized books I've ever seen in my life. And I think mostly because, I don't know, for readers who haven't read it, it's organized around different relationships to freedom, defining it, practicing it, imagining it. And it does a very good job of actually keeping those separate. Uh, but it's one of those tricks in which, even in doing so, there's like a narrative arc, even if it feels like there's separate categories. Uh, but I think that was a pretty good summary. Felipa's story, I don't know, at the end of the book, Felipa's story is you really want to give her like more space as being some kind of like also archival anomaly in the sense that her, well, she is in the sense that the first letters from a enslaved woman that we have in the archive from that period, right? As you say. But also I thought, like, for example, others had also archival uniqueness to them, like Sosa. Because she was involved in 3 different trials that capture her at 3 different periods of her life. So one of the things that I wanted to start a conversation with while everybody starts getting their ideas together and ask questions to Chloe is this main claim that you substantiate through a very large archival scope that we are seeing the formation of a Black Republic of Letters. Something, or at least a Black public sphere. I think the term that you would use is public sphere, but I'm thinking here of Julius Scott's The Common Wind. That comes at the Haitian Revolution. You read Chloe, you read Julius Scott, right? And the
Yeah.
Common Wind, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in a sense, it seems like Julius Scott is describing like the final chapter of or at least a middle chapter of something you right before we start seeing the transition towards uh, print culture, like access to print presses and print culture in the middle of the 19th century. We still have this kind of common wind of letters that you seem to be tracing the beginning of.
Yeah.
And you do so by looking at all these desperate archives, some of them exemplary, some of them full of silences, some of them weird. And I was wondering if you could actually tell us a little bit more about how you see this long arc. Sorry, I'm always the guy who asks questions that take you outside of your book. But if you see yourself with connections, I think you do a pretty solid job of planting yourself well in the Iberian studies, early Atlantic 16th century, 17th century. But I wanted to see if this infrastructure you're describing connects in your head to what we see in the era of revolution or even in the 18th century.
Just if you, Chloe, can you stop sharing your screen?
Yeah, sorry.
Ah, yes,
Yes.
good point. Yes.
Stop share. There we go. Yeah, perfect. Hang on, there we go. Okay, sorry. For some reason I can only see myself now, but it's okay. I presume you can all see me, and there we go. I can change the view. I can now we're in a gallery.
No,
altogether.
you are not
Perfect.
supposed to change the view. Go ahead,
sorry.
because like this we see you in the
Okay.
video.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for that. Great question. Thank you for reading the book. It's such a pleasure and privilege, and just so interesting to see people's different reactions. I think that, I mean, using the term Black public sphere in the 16th century is definitely a provocation that I chose to use. You know, it was very much wanting to kind of put sort of basically kind of spark debate about the significance of these ideas, right? It's absolutely clear that people who are racialized as Black and the victims of slavery in this period are thinking about and understanding what slavery and freedom means because it affects their lives, right? But by coining it and thinking about it as a public sphere, then suddenly we're thinking about the broader significance of those ideas beyond the individual, right? Whether it's through petitions to the Crown for freedom, or whether it's practices, whether it's about gathering documentation to prove freedom, whatever the case may be. And sort of my broad argument is that all of this, including the very monotonous, boring thing of going to a notary and recording a commercial transaction, is all part of being an active member of that public sphere. And its relationship to the kind of later period, if you sort of went to kind of revolutionary period, I think one of the things that this book is sort of asking us to think about, but doesn't do so explicitly, is our own biases as historians and what we expect to find in the past. And I think that whenever I was working on this, you know, sort of as I was doing research, a lot of things I found really surprised me, like the idea that, you know, you could find information about your lost partner, your lost spouse, through word of mouth was something that kind of surprised me in my expectation of what people knew and could communicate about from a particular site. And so I think this is a book that's trying to really get us to rethink what people knew in the period that they were living and how they communicated, how they saw the world around them, and what kind of technology was available to them, regardless of whether or not they themselves know how to write and are writing, but actually that they understand the mechanism that I can communicate in this way by paying this amount of money and finding these particular trusted messengers and whatever. So I think a lot of it is also about the fact that this has been invisible in many archives, but it's also been invisible because a lot of historians kind of have not sort of haven't been able to see it, or haven't been willing to see it, or haven't been able to. It's sort of very hard to think about a history of word of mouth between port towns amongst the Bolton communities. Like, this is not a particularly easy thing to do. So in terms of the long arc, I think that probably wherever we look between the 16th century and the 19th century, in particular sites, we would find versions of this, or how people are trying to communicate and understand the world that they live in. And especially when we're talking about people who either forcibly or voluntarily are being separated across vast distances, that often people find ways to stay in touch, especially if there is an already existing parallel, kind of massive trade and communication going on. So I think it's very different. Like if you're sending a message between Sevilla and Cartagena, that's probably very easy. Whereas if we're talking about a little village in, I don't know, Córdoba and Arequipa, that might be a much more complicated set of, kind of communication ties. But I do think that there's been a sort of willful inability to think through the possibilities of what does it mean that someone like Felipa, who's enslaved her whole life in one city and doesn't have success, doesn't have anything, but yet she knows she's in conversation, she's hearing things, she's, the world is kind of moving around her, right? And what happens when we think about the significance of that? So I don't know if that's really answered your question, but I'm happy to sort of go back and forth more on it if you like.
No, I thought it tells me how you're thinking about it. And now, one of the things that I know you're making two provocative things, or at least I saw you making two provocative things. Once here was calling this a public sphere, which I wouldn't have necessarily. And also actually saying that this is all about that this is an intellectual history project trying to recover Black thought. I also thought that was very provocative, since it's one of the most materialist books that I've read this year so far. And yet you enlist all the materialist and archival analysis for the sake of an intellectual history, which fine. But let me bracket that one. We can revisit it if people don't have questions. But let's go back to the original one, because why wouldn't I have made the choice? Because like one of the things that I understand about these kinds of underground networks is that they're half visible and half invisible, or like they're not public and they're not private, right? They surface at particular moments. They're there and they leave traces of like what they are, but they're mostly in camouflage mode, mostly because these are people living on their oppression. Saying the wrong thing can get you in trouble, right? So you have to say the right thing in public. So this public sphere is usually kind of like not how we imagine freedom of speech to work, say 4 years ago in the United States of America. But anyways, that's like public sphere is not how I would say, but you don't only call it public sphere, you call it knowledge infrastructure too sometimes. And I think I could roll with that a little bit more. Because an infrastructure doesn't necessarily imply visibility. Like you don't necessarily see it. In fact, infrastructures usually are invisible. But anyways, yes, all of that to say that uh, you did uh, you did start me you answered my question well. I did in my mind. I want to make
Yeah.
that connection to the world of
Yeah.
Julius Scott's right before Black Atlantic writers and authors have massive access to the printing press in the 19th century, right starting in Haiti with the Bastille and all those people, right? But like before then, what do we have in the Atlantic? And I think you do.
Yeah. So I think just for me, the public sphere, its significance as a concept is less about the public nature of it and more about the political significance of what we think of as a public sphere, right? In the sense of like these ideas matter and have an effect, have a shape on whether community level or society level or rule of law. And I think for me, it was really important to move this away from a kind of cultural history of something, to actually say that, these ideas are fundamental for the ways in which slavery and freedom as legal categories emerge, whether it's, in kind of court by court basis or through practice, through the collection of freedom papers, etc. And so the provocation is really like, this shouldn't just be something that we're interested in because we're interested in colonial Latin American history, history of society. It should be something we're interested in as people who are interested in kind of important ideas of, that develop in the Atlantic world space. And I think probably the later, like scholarship on the later kind of revolutionary periods has that sort of impact. But I think in this early period, you sort of risk it just being read by other people interested in colonial Latin American history. And I think that was really the kind of big provocation. It was definitely with the aim of having a debate, right, about what makes an idea an intellectual idea, what makes a person intellectual, and engaging in all of that. And why is the discomfort about these particular actors being intellectual actors, and what does it mean when we deny them that, right? When we deny people who were themselves victims of slavery kind of the right to be part of that intellectual tradition about thinking through, and obviously what the book doesn't deal with, but flight from slavery is also another element, right? The kind of history of marronage, etc. So yeah, but I think it's, I'm glad that you picked up on it, because this is the whole point of writing something like this, right? To make us think through all of that.
Anna?
So here I am. Thank you, Chloe, for this really fascinating book, which indeed I reviewed, which means that I clearly read it in detail. And there are three major points that that perhaps you could develop more. Then one of them is the book. You emphasize how these Catholic fraternities played a role in this process that of then creating this public sphere, and then engaging with ideas and legal dimensions of slavery and freedom. Then this is one of the dimensions that that if you would like to develop. Indeed, there are four. The other one, which is really fascinating, is how these some of your actors who are African born. I think that for me this is the most fascinating case, because this is, of course, is a very early period, but in addition to being a very early period, you have those who were born in Africa making the case that they were indeed free, and how this is different than from, of course, those who were born in the Americas. Then I think that I even wrote something here that that in terms of why this is particularly fascinating, that you show that these African-born enslaved individuals engaged in ideas of slavery and freedom in ways that contrasted then with their counterparts. And among others, they publicly claimed in their petitions that their parents were free. This is fascinating, because all the idea of slavery then in the Atlantic world, as it starts then with the rise of the Atlantic slave trade, becomes that enslaved people are those who were then their mothers were enslaved. But here they are making the claim, because of course those who were born in Africa, their parents were free. Also, the other point that is fascinating is the role of women. Then I think that here you don't make this book a book about women, but women, they are central. And again, it's very interesting, because you are arguing for this public sphere, not only in terms of the oral exchanges, but also of written exchanges. And these women, they were writing very, very early. Finally, the other point that perhaps, and this is a question that I had when I was reading and reviewing the book, was these complicated categories for anyone who is working on this period that you are in the Americas, that these individuals that are then labeled as Black, then the Black thought dimension. But these individuals, they were still claiming a variety of other identities as negros, morenos, and so on. And if you would like to say something about that. But otherwise, it's a really a wonderful book that is clearly written, and also very precise in terms of each of these terms that you are using, and how they change over time, but also not only over time, but across these different parts of the Spanish Empire. So I will stop here because this is too long. Go ahead.
Thank you for really great questions. I'm actually going to try and answer or speak to all of them, but also just say thanks again for reading. I think for both you and Alex, this book is quite far, outside of the wheelhouse. So I'm really, really grateful for that. So in terms of Catholic confraternities, this project started as a PhD project, right? This wasn't a book, it was a PhD project. It was someone very naive trying to do a kind of very strange project about what happens, what does freedom mean, and how do people move across places, and how would you, what kind of archives would even record that, right? Basically, let's just imagine that you are one is enslaved on a plantation somewhere, and they obtain their liberty, and then they decide to go and work in another city because that's where the opportunities are. Like, what kind of archive would even capture that movement? And so that's kind of where I started, and especially thinking about the people who move to the Americas. How can, and so in the Spanish Empire, there's this lovely institution called the House of Trade, which actually, because the crown wants to control all passengers, required everybody to get a passenger license. And so actually that was a kind of window into some of that mobility. And the other window was Inquisition cases, especially related to bigamy, where someone goes somewhere else and gets married another time, and it unravels this whole world of mobility, and a few others. But what my initial theory was that surely the institutions helping individuals to present cases for licenses to travel across the Atlantic must be Black confraternities. So my initial theory was like, read all of these testimonies, witness testimonies, and all the supporting paper, because I'm sure that what you're going to unravel is this huge infrastructure of Black confraternities, helping out. And obviously in Sevilla, there's a very significant Black confraternity. I found none of that, basically. I found all sorts of other things, all sorts of other ties and what have you. But my point was that I kind of assumed that the Black confraternity would be the center of kind of social life for helping, strategizing among individuals. And I'm sure it might have done in some cases, but there's this whole other world as well outside of confraternities that I think is also something that maybe a lot of our kind of obsession and focus on these institutions, religious Catholic institutions, maybe we haven't seen some of that other world of commercial transactions, of just neighborly relations over a period of time, or enslaved people working in the same household, and then one gets liberated and then they have a relationship, etc. So I think I obviously have a chapter on Black confraternities, trying to think about their role, especially in terms of kind of the big political ideas about freedom, about broadening the meanings of freedom, and I think they play a really big role. But I think sometimes our sort of unilateral focus on them makes us not see all this other life, which maybe isn't necessarily by people who are members of confraternities. But my next project is trying to think more about kind of confraternities within this story and as sort of political entities. So that's a really great question, and hopefully it kind of, my answer helps us to see a bit of what's going on there. And yeah, the question about how some actors are Africa born, and the claims they're making about being free, I agree, they're really extraordinary cases, and I feel very strongly that these are the tip of the iceberg, just because the cases that we have are cases that got to on appeal to either Real Audiencia or Consejo de Indias. And so for example, in the Cartagena context, there's all these references to loads of other cases taking place at the level of the Teniente General, I think it's called. So the person who is in charge in Cartagena, and all of that, as far as I'm aware, is gone. So the only ones that we have are ones that, got appealed for whatever reason and went to the Real Audiencia in Santa Fe. And the cases that we have are just extraordinary. They show us a understanding in some cases of the rule of law in the Iberian Atlantic world that sort of not unimaginable, but just we didn't have evidence for it before. And when we think about it, the particular case of Francisco Martín is somebody who grows up in Cachel as a free man. He's not enslaved by any local leader, and suddenly finds himself on a ship, going through the Middle Passage. And of course, he argues for his freedom, right? Because from his concept of the place that he comes from, he hasn't been legitimately enslaved by anyone. So I think those cases are really important for helping us to see not just different ideas about slavery and freedom in sites in West Africa and West Central Africa, but also just people's understanding of the rule of law in the Iberian world, per se, from those sites. And I think the one that I find more interesting is the case of, I can't remember what his name is, but it's somebody who was enslaved in West Africa and sent to Spain. And then when his owner in Spain then took him to the Caribbean, where he was liberated. And upon being liberated, he was re-enslaved illegitimately. He wasn't given his freedom. And I find the argument in that case really fascinating, in the sense that it's somebody who's kind of understanding, like, I was a victim of enslavement in West Africa, and that was torturous and awful, but that was legitimate under the Iberian rule of law. What's just happened now, where his enslaver had died and had liberated him, and then he was kind of re-enslaved. That's the moment when he had a case for the to claim his freedom. So I think it's really interesting, and it really nuances, in my view, kind of our understanding of what people knew or could have known in certain places, and how quickly people acquired legal knowledge and legal know-how. And also what that chapter does in particular is trying to trace through those cases all the conversations that these people engender in their search for a court of law where they can pursue their freedom, and what effect that could have on other people enslaved or free. And of course, people can have knowledge about illegitimate enslavement and not take their case to court. They might just pass that knowledge on to someone else. And I think that's something that chapter really tries to look at. And then the last two, so the role of women is central in the book, and the book doesn't do a huge amount about gender necessarily. And I think I just couldn't quite conceive of it at that point when I was writing. I think everything is so fragmentary, or at least that's what it felt when I was researching it. It felt very hard to sort of make a overarching statement about sort of gendered ideas about slavery and freedom is different in this way or that way. But yeah, as we've seen, women are absolutely central and doing all sorts of really important things to develop and exchange and move ideas about slavery and freedom in all sorts of ways. So I hope that's something that will be taken up by others, really, and these kinds of cases will be looked at through that more gendered line. And then finally, the complicated categories and why Black thought. I mean, obviously, I went round and round in different ideas. And I think partly in the end, why I came to Black thought is part of the reason also about the provocation, about thinking through public sphere, intellectual history, thought with a capital T, right? History of political thought, this is Black thought. And also, while there were lots of different categories that people used, in the Iberian world in this period, there is a racialization process going on, in the sense that Iberians are perceiving and are racializing people as negative in a particular way, regardless of where on the coast, on the very long coast, one came from, what ethnicity, what language one spoke. There's a sort of, there's a transformation into negative. And everybody who is racialized in that way has to contend with slavery and freedom. Everybody who is racialized in that way in the 16th century is going to be having a more precarious time in relation to protecting either their freedom or trying to evade enslavement. Like, I think that's just like a reality that we have to accept. Like, yes, of course, there are exceptional people. I talk about many of them in my book who are wealthy traders or whatever, but I mean, even they are being referred to as negative or negative. Like, it's something that I think is inescapable. So it's also a way of recognizing that in a sort of strange way, without trying to flatten it, and also to recognize this isn't a book about intellectual history of either West Africa or West Central Africa, of which there's really important work. This is actually about what happens when you become this racialized person in the Atlantic world. So yeah, but thank you. They're 4 great questions.
Thank you so much. And let's see if you have more questions. Let me just remove my... Alex, you are muted. Yes.
I was saying, hi, Alessandra, Iris, Jennifer, Karen, Lise, Micaela. Jump in, turn on your camera.
Hi,
Hola, Iris.
Oh, hello. Good to see you. I was wondering if you did find any evidences of written culture, and because we know that some slaves came from, the Islamic education. They knew how to write and they have manuscripts. They carry these manuscripts, their books also. As you have worked with the Inquisition sources, maybe you find, have you dealt with this?
Thank you. It's a great question. Not very much. I mean, I've worked with people who write or engage in writing, but not necessarily who acquired those skills in West Africa or West Central Africa. I mean, those cases exist, perhaps slightly later, but it's not something that I've found necessarily in the sources I'm looking at. Although it's quite hard to tell sometimes, right? Because I mean, there's one example, right? Is that there's a woman who is from Cabo Verde who's described as black, and she's described as someone who has freedom papers, which would imply that she had been enslaved at some point and then liberated. And she turns up in the archive because she traveled from Cabo Verde to Sevilla, claiming to want to liberate her sister from slavery. So it's like a really kind of extraordinary tale. And it seems like she writes, like it seems like she's somebody who can write. But I couldn't tell you much more about her biography other than these things I've just told you, right? So it's like it's kind of quite hard sometimes to really, know. I mean, maybe she had not been enslaved. She was just a free woman who, because she knew she was going to travel, she acquired some kind of document to say that she was free, right? They're just sort of things I can't quite get into in that detail. But certainly I think that there are, many Inquisition cases, some of which scholars have already looked at, where these kinds of things appear or are hinted at, but not in the period I'm looking at, or just not what I've looked at. Because I mean, I'm sort of limited in a way by the basin in the Atlantic and the time period I was thinking about, and mostly connections between those spaces. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if that was something that we came to find. I think that there's, again, thinking about the kind of our own blindness to certain parts of the past, that we find some things more surprising, or we're not expecting it, right? And I think that probably would be something that will come up. But I think we do have to find ways of looking in very boring archives in very extensive ways to try and find this, right? So the evidence of writing, for example, I've found in 16th century Sevilla is not something that just kind of appeared, fell off a shelf. It's sort of quite extensive reading testimonies about people's lives and about what they're saying, about how and when they spoke with so and so, and etc. And suddenly you see, like, oh wow, she's talking about the fact she received a letter, and what does that mean, and how she heard the letter being read. Now, this could all be a lie, but nonetheless, she's saying it, she's presenting it in a way, as a part of a formal process. But that's, I think, quite a sort of long-winded way of finding evidence of that form of literacy. So, in the example that you gave, like, what kind of an archive would that turn up in other than the Inquisition? And probably when we start asking those questions, we might start seeing that.
No, yes, no. Because I was thinking about the people who make the they worked as interpreters, mainly in the Spanish also, but in the Portuguese now, they received their freedom after 4 or 5 travelings, and so they knew how to speak, and they interact with the missionaries to make this kind of dictionaries and
But I'd be excited to see what's next. And I mean, obviously, this book was quite limited to the fact that everything that I was looking at had to be about ideas about slavery and freedom. So there's a lot of things that kind of just fell out, right? Because that's just a choice I made. And I think, the whole world of what does literacy mean, writing cultures, I'd love to do more work on it. It was very much a subsidiary in a way in this book, because this was trying to really think very specifically about, those two concepts. But I think it's definitely there, and I hope either I or others will take it up.
I must read. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Iris. Now we have Karen, and I will add her.
So thank you. Hi, Chloe. It's so
Hiya.
lovely to see you.
You too.
I have read the book. I love the book. I was involved in various different stages of reading the manuscript, and it's just as Alex said, it's just kind of a marvel what you've done in terms of the construction. I want to recommend this in fact, I'm actually currently reading a manuscript, and part of me just wants to say, you need to read Chloe's book to
Oh.
understand structure, right? To how to tell the story in really clear and evidence-based ways. What I wanted to ask you about, though, is about the fragment. And you said this in your introduction that we often think of fragments as the really negative thing that we have to deal with in terms of evidence. But what I love about what you've done here is you've turned it into something positive that is reading widely across archives and looking at lots of different fragmentary evidence is what actually gave you a story whereas I think the traditional historical idea is that you want to trace a person over time and put that person back together. And you do that a little bit with Felipa, but mostly not, right? Mostly you're just kind of putting. So I just wondered if you would just talk a little more about that, because it's one of the things that I think is really an important contribution of the book.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for just being such a great friend to the project. I think sometimes when you have a project that's kind of too big, it's quite hard to know, am I just sort of completely lost? And you've always been, so wonderful in that. But I think the fragment question is a really wonderful one. For a long time, I felt like I just had this kind of large array of exceptional cases. And every time I present it anywhere, everyone say, well, it's just, this is an exception. It's just an exception. It's an exception. And sort of all these fragments were kind of decontextualized in a way. And so, to have an interesting thing about someone writing a letter in Sevilla, or an interesting thing about this, and it kind of, I could feel that it was questioning a lot of the sort of knowledge I had about the time period, about ideas about race, about all this kind of stuff, but I couldn't quite figure out how. And I think one of the things that really clicked for me, the conversation with a lot of people, probably including yourself, is sort of thinking actually much more spatially about people, where kind of what's going on in a space, whether it's Felipa in Sevilla, or whether it's like Mexico City in a decade, or or the I did a lot of work on that the route between Veracruz and Mexico City, right, over kind of the late 16th century, like putting all these fragments onto spaces, I think really helped me to understand this isn't just exceptional, this is actually like quite a normal part of life, and sort of and also thinking about different fragments from different kinds of archives. So like if you have thinking about something like Veracruz history, like notarial archives, those fragments telling you something, Inquisition cases telling you something else, petitions for licenses from Sevilla telling you another thing, probate cases something else, and suddenly all these fragments kind of paint this picture that just looked really different from what you imagined or what you'd understood it to be. But I think for me, it was about the assembling. It wasn't just about, oh, here's a random fragment. It was more about thinking through how places that actually don't have very clear ways to write or research those kind of histories. If you want to think about, like, I want to be interested in what it means to be free in Mexico City in the early 17th century, it's not quite clear how you'd go about that necessarily. I mean, people do, but it's tough. So I think the fragments made me realize and take seriously every single person mentioned in one of these fragments is a person with a world who was making an extreme effort to liberate themselves or their kin, or to live within slavery, or whatever they were trying to do, and they really merit our attention. Like their intellectual labor for them was so much more important in their lives, right? Than like it was the central feature of their lives. So I think it took a long time to figure out, and there's a lot of fragments that never made it into the book, right? There's a lot of things that just kind of didn't quite fit. But I think it was the kind of fragments of different types of archives put onto spaces. And then, as I was saying in the introduction, either thinking about it in terms of people going through a space and what that means for the people there, or different fragments on one large space. And I mean, the whole history about purchasing freedom in New Spain, like I think it's clear to all of us who work in this field that people were purchasing their freedom. That's not something that's new at all. but I hadn't understood like what are the mechanics by which somebody actually acquires credit or money to purchase their freedom, and how is that negotiated on a broader scale that's not just like one particular case that we have in a court case or what have you. And that sort of gathering all the fragments that I could from notarial records and putting it on that particular space helped me to see actually that there's kind of like quite large scale kind of intellectual history of ideas going on where people are basically like trying to seek credit even though they're enslaved in order to purchase their freedom, and are developing credit worthiness and trust with passers-by. And I think, that is a really good example of kind of putting all those fragments together. And then, we see the kind of the reality of what that looks like by then thinking about, oh, there's a case in the Inquisition that tells us what life is like for one of these people. And so it's being quite creative in that way. But I'm sure there'll be traditional historians who turn around and say, that method is not valid, and we need to think about other types of, but this is a provocation in so many ways. And part of it is also about who gets to be a historical subject, who gets to be a thinker, and how we need to desperately kind of come up with new and creative ways of actually accounting for and telling these histories that a lot of traditional methodology doesn't allow us. And I've been having a lot of conversations about kind of the ways that our disciplines discipline us, and especially with colleagues in Spanish and literature, and they feel it a lot more. And I think, in history, we also need to think about that, right? There are definite ways. And, your book, Karen, of like this kind of parallel comparative, work, right? You must have felt very similarly that like I'm doing something that's a bit out of the ordinary, but really, really important. So I think this book was definitely trying to sort of to write history in a very different kind of way that is still very grounded in evidence.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have Lisette. I read her and
thank you. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Congratulations, Chloe.
Thank you.
I just want to say that I am very much looking forward to reading the book. I haven't read it yet, and I am glad that I was able to shift some time around so that I can be present and listen and learn more about it. I want to thank you for including the translations of Felipa's letters and the other material that you have made available, because I feel that I don't know, that it was customary. I mean, it's getting better now, but I feel that scholars in the past would hoard their knowledge and not make it as open and available. I, for example, had the experience that I called a senior scholar and asked about, the folios that they consulted in Spain. And I just wanted to know the exact numbers so so that I can go to Sevilla and get them myself. And mind you, this scholar already had transcribed and had all of the information and already written over 10 books. And the scholar was like, well, I have that at home, and hung up on me.
Wow.
And I was like, okay, off I go to Sevilla. And because, sometimes also citing is the way that you cite. If you say, audiencia 75, but if you don't say the folio, audiencia 75 could be this, thick, and you have to go through thousands and thousands of folios. So I want to say thank you for that, and I look forward to go deeper into it. And most certainly, thank you for choosing a map that actually says Santo Domingo as one of the ports of entry of trade, for Blacks, for enslaved Blacks, because it is also customary that most of the maps that we see in the books, the arrow goes straight to Saint Domingue, and which happened 197 years later. I mean, clearly coming to that western side of the island. So I saw the map, and I'm here. My camera was off, but I was like, I was clapping to see it, because it is too often ignored and mentioned that Santo Domingo, to include Santo Domingo, and even to mention that Santo Domingo the Spanish side was the first port of entry. So thank you so much. I appreciated that. I appreciated seeing that.
Well, thank you. It's so lovely to meet you. I've been wanting to meet you for a long time, so I'm really, really privileged that you're here. So thank you for that. I'll speak to two things because the translations were hard, right? They weren't easy, and I first found those letters a long time ago before I knew anything, and I was just like, "What is this?" And it was so unclear to me what the relevance of this was. Whether I didn't even know that the author was an enslaved woman. You know, it took like a lot of patience and reading and trying to figure out. And then for a few years, I knew I was an enslaved woman, but I didn't really know much else, and I was busy doing other things. And then finally, a few years ago, I kind of stopped and thought with it, and I thought maybe this could be interesting for thinking about like something in Sevilla. And because of who owned her, it's an absolute miracle. I was able to locate like where she lived. And that took me a long time, and I've been engaging with lots of historians of the Spanish nobility. Like they send them emails all the time, like, "Hey, can you help me out?" Like, so that kind of suddenly gave me this ability to do that work. But what I was going to say about the translations is that because I spent so much time reading, rereading, thinking about them, I really felt like this had to be kind of recovered in a way. It had to be, somebody had to do that labor of, especially the more I found out about her and the more I discovered and what's in the book now. I mean, there's more that I've discovered since, right? She was an extraordinary character, and I just felt this is such an important thing that absolutely has to be recovered. And then quite often I do seminars with grad students where we'll read the coda and we read all these debates about kind of anti-recovery. And I said, there's a point where like this labor has to be done for things like this, and it will, I think, transform a lot of the ways we teach and etc. And then deciding to translate it was a whole other thing. I think had I known how hard it is to translate, even though I'm bilingual, I maybe wouldn't have done it. But I was so naive that I just sort of asked a few friends for help and did it. So, you know, I'm sure there'll be holes, and I'm sure other people will come in and correct them, and that's great. But I think there's so much. I'm really excited to see what people do with those leathers, and you know, I've kind of done all the work that I need to do on that. So, but yeah, I think it's really important, and I think that even just having things in parallel translation for teaching purposes, and I have a lot of connection with Spanish literature and Spanish studies, so I understand that. And yeah, with the map, I can't remember whether Santo Domingo, I can't remember putting it on there, but what the reason I drew that map, which again may well have many errors, but I just couldn't find a map that was like relevant for the 16th century. Everything was kind of a later period, you know, maps thinking about slave trade, later periods. And there's something about the 16th century, about the Carrera de Indias, the beginning of the Middle Passage as the transatlantic slave trade. And so, yeah, that was the attempt, and that's why Santo Domingo's on there. But I think we need more better mapping for the earlier period. But yeah, it's so lovely to meet you, and thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, likewise.
Thank you, Lisette, and Lisette. Her book, the edited book, is the next one in the line. I would like to ask a final question, just to because I think that is important, given that this time you are in this edition of the Slaveryarchive, we have been focusing so much more on than books that are covering than the Spanish Atlantic world. I would have two quick questions. One, that in the beginning of the book, then and in your introduction, you mentioned then a number of works that have been doing similar efforts that are related to what you did here. Then I think that you mentioned then Michelle McKinley, probably Herman Bennett. I know that Karen also is in that zone. But all of these historians, they have been doing much work on the Spanish, in the early Spanish Atlantic world. And your book is very early too. But there is not much new work being done on Portugal. Then we have works that have been done, but in English there is not much work being done on Lisbon, for example, and on other Portuguese cities in that very early period. And this is something that I ask myself if you have any ideas of why. The second question would be regarding if you know at this point what is the reception of your book in Spain. because we had then the book by Aurélie, co-edited by Aurélie Violetta a few weeks ago. And of course, that we know that either Portugal and Spain are behind in terms of memorializing slavery and the Atlantic slave trade in their public spaces. And this book here, of course, more we have books that tell this very early history than, and in your case, you are even able to the fact that you use the map and then you lead us through Sevilla to see how this Black presence was anchored in the public space. Then it's not about the public sphere, then we have the locations. And Karen did something similar in her book, even if she adds more other dimensions than not only people of African descent. But I asked myself, what is the reception we know? And because this makes so strong, even stronger, the case about the Black presence and the importance of slavery in Spain.
Thank you. Those are two great finishing questions. So yeah, the work on Portugal, I agree. I think that there's going to be, I mean, obviously Brazil is a kind of different story, especially for later periods, but the kind of, who's writing on Black Lisbon is something that I'm sure very soon will be taken up. I've heard a few presentations from different scholars who are touching on it. So, maybe that will appear in due course. I don't know how much institutional support there has been in Portugal academic culture for that kind of history. So it may well be someone trained in North America or Brazil or elsewhere. But I can't really speak to that. I can only say that the course of COVID happening kind of changed my book to becoming just Spain. Initially, my lofty idea had been it would be, the whole Iberian Atlantic, and I just realized actually, you have to find your phrase, right? So maybe in the future I'll do more. But I have heard some really exciting presentations by young scholars, so I'm excited that there might be. And there is obviously also some kind of older work, especially on confraternities and things. It's just, it hasn't felt like there's been much momentum in it. The reception of the book in Spain, I'm not sure. It's very early days. I've presented it in a few places and people have been really excited and interested by it. I think a lot of Spanish historians who've been open with me have said that they've really enjoyed it, but that they're kind of anxious about how it's going to be received because they're not quite sure if the methods will be widely accepted. So I found that really interesting. That they say, I found it really helpful. I read it. I really enjoyed it, but I'm interested to see what the reviewers say. And I'm like, well, so I think there's definitely something kind of a little bit against the rules going on in this book in terms of what how Spanish history in Spain is written. But I think there's also, there's a lot of collaboration, and I have a lot of colleagues in Spain who are interested in this. But there's definitely, I think in Spanish social history, it's much more about big numbers and demography. They call it like vaciar de archivos, so it's kind of thinking about baptism of enslaved people on a large scale, right? And this kind of work that I'm doing is very different. But in terms of more public reception, I'm not sure. It being a monograph, I don't know how it's going to go. I'm writing a trade book now, which is kind of summarizing and continuing on a little bit of this. And that really is very poignantly aimed at this kind of lack of institutional and memory of slavery in Spain. And I think that one will be very provocative and probably more likely to be picked up. But who knows? What will happen. But it's been fairly okay, I'd say, so far in Spain.
Thank you so much. Then I don't know if you have any more questions. That it's probably time for us to conclude. Then I will bring Alex here to the spotlight, and to thank Chloe for this wonderful book, a book that I don't have here with me because I am not at home and I didn't bring any. Then the book is Slavery and Freedom. And this was published then with Cambridge University Press early 2025. Indeed, it was published late 2024, but copyright of 2025. And we thank Chloe for this presentation and the book. And we are going to have our next book club. Will be with Lisette's added book, Transatlantic Bondage, and we'll continue then in the Spanish Atlantic world. So it's just that you are going to take a break, and this is going to be, I think that the next one is going to be then for
When
this
is it? Is it June?
August.
It's in
No,
August.
no,
Yes.
it's August. It's August.
We're gonna take a summer vacation. Wow.
Yes.
I'm very
Yes.
proud of I'm very, very proud of everybody.
Yes, we're very proud. I was contained, and like I was not allowed to do then June and July, but you will be back in August with Lisette. Meanwhile,
Lisette,
go
please
get
read this one in the meantime, Lisette, because
Yes.
I read yours already. The thing is that this one and yours combined, including with Aureli, create kind of a textured vision of the Spanish Empire at the beginning of like 16th century, like Black life in the Americas and in Spain that I never had before. I don't think very few people have before. Like if you combine these three books.
yes.
Um,
And we are lucky that we have all these books like coming out at the same time, that we can have them in dialogue, and that they were edited and written by women historians, because I think that this is important as well. I don't think that everybody agrees, but most of us, we agree. This is why we are here. So thank you so much, Chloe, again for this great book. And Lisette, we're looking forward to having you and some of your authors coming in August. And
August 23rd.
yes, exactly. Then you will be disseminating information soon, not too soon, because otherwise people forget. Yes, yes. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for those
Thank you so much.
who came. Thank you,
Thank you
Chloe.
to all the people in the
Thank you,
audience. Thank
everyone.
you.
Take
Bye,
care.
Chloe.
Bye.
Thank you. Nos vemos,
Okay.
Lisette.
Bye, bye, bye.
Dale. All right, did you stop recording? I'm gonna stop recording. Hold on. I'm gonna stop recording. Stop recording. All right. All right,
Okay.
the recording
And
stopped, and you're still streaming to YouTube.
oops. 1 sec.